The Russian Liberation Army was a group of predominantly Russian forces that fought under German command during World War II. The army was led by Andrey Vlasov, a defected Red Army general, and members of the army are often referred to as Vlasovtsy. In 1944, it became known as the Armed Forces of the Committee for the Liberation of the Peoples of Russia. The ROA was organized by former Red Army General Andrey Vlasov, who tried to unite Russians opposed to communism and the Soviet leader Joseph Stalin with the goal of fighting with Germany to liberate Russia. The volunteers were mostly Soviet prisoners of war but also included White Russian migrant copyright S. On November 14, 1944 it was officially renamed the Armed Forces of the Committee for the Liberation of the Peoples of Russia, with the KONR being formed as political body for the army to be loyal to. On January 28, 1945, it was officially declared that the Russian divisions no longer formed part of the German army, but would directly be under the command of KONR. Origins: Russian volunteers who enlisted into the German army wore the patch of the Russian Liberation Army, an army which did not yet exist but was presented as a reality by Nazi propaganda. These volunteers were not under any Russian command or control. They were exclusively under German command, carrying out various non-combat duties. A number of them were employed at the Battle of Stalingrad, where it was estimated that as much as 1/4 of the Sixth Army's strength were Soviet citizens. Soon, several German commanders began forming small armed units out of them for various tasks, including combat against Soviet partisans, driving vehicles, carrying wounded, and delivering supplies. Adolf Hitler allowed the idea of the Russian Liberation Army to circulate in propaganda literature so long as no real formations of the sort were permitted. As a result, some Red Army soldiers surrendered or defected in hopes of joining an army that did not yet exist. Many Soviet prisoners of war volunteered to serve under the German command just in order to get out from Nazi POW camps which were notorious for starving Soviet prisoners to death. Meanwhile, the newly captured Soviet General Andrey Vlasov, along with his German and Russian allies, was desperately lobbying the German High Command, hoping that a green light would be given for the formation of a real armed force that would be exclusively under Russian control. They were able to somewhat win over Alfred Rosenberg. Hitler's staff repeatedly rejected these appeals with hostility, refusing to even consider them. Still, Vlasov and his allies reasoned that Hitler would eventually come to realize the futility of a war against the USSR with the hostility of the Russian people and respond to Vlasov's demands. Irrespective of the political wrangling over Vlasov and the status of the ROA, the reality by mid-1943 was several 100,000 ex-Soviet volunteers were serving in the German forces either as highways or in Eastern volunteer units. These latter were generally deployed in a security role in the rear areas of the armies and army groups in the East, where they constituted a major part of the German capacity to counter the activity of Soviet partisan forces, dating as far back as early 1942. The Germans were, however, always concerned about their reliability, and with the German setbacks in the summer of 1943 the situation took a turn for the worse. On September 12, for example, Second Army had to withdraw Sturm BTL. AOK-2 in order to deal with what is described as a Euro-OE several mutinies and desertions of Eastern units. A September 14 communication from the Army states that in the recent period, highway absenteeism had risen strongly. Following a series of mutinies attempted or successful and a surge in desertions, they decided in September 1942 that the reliability of these units had fallen to levels where they were more a liability than an asset. In an October 1943 report, 8th Army concluded grimly, all local volunteers are unreliable during enemy contact. Principal reason of unreliability is the employment of these volunteers in the East. 2 days previously, Army had recorded in the KTB stern measures to be taken in the event of further cases of rebellion or unreliability, investing in regimental commanders far-reaching powers to perform summary courts and execute the verdicts. Since it was considered that it would improve their reliability if they were removed from contact with the local population, it was decided to send them to the West, which the majority of them were in late 1943 and early 1944. A large number of these battalions were hence integrated into the divisions in the west. A number of such soldiers were on guard in Normandy on D-Day, and without the equipment or the motivation to fight the Allies, most promptly surrendered. There were instances of bitter fighting to the very end, triggered by mishandled propaganda from the Allies that accurately told of the quick repatriation of soldiers back to the Soviet Union after they gave up. A total of 71 Eastern battalions served on the Eastern Front, while 42 battalions served in Belgium, Finland, France, and Italy. An aerial component from Russian volunteers was formed as Ostfliegerstaffel in December 1943, only to be disbanded before seeing combat in July 1944. The Russian airmen were regrouped into the night harassment Squadronate, whose first and only mission took place on April 13, 1945, when they attacked a Soviet bridgehead at Erlenhof, on the Oder River. Formation of ROA and the fight against Red Army. The ROA did not officially exist until autumn of 1944, after Heinrich Himmler persuaded a very reluctant Hitler to permit the formation of 10 Russian Liberation Army divisions. On November 14 in Prague, Vlasov read aloud the Prague Manifesto before the newly created Committee for the Liberation of the Peoples of Russia. This document stated the purposes of the battle against Stalin, and spelled out 14 democratic points which the army was fighting for. German insistence that the document carry anti-Semitic rhetoric was successfully parried by Vlasov's committee. However, they were obliged to include a statement criticizing the Western Allies, labeling them plutocracies that were allies of Stalin in his conquest of Europe. By February 1945, only one division, the 1st Infantry, was fully formed, under the command of General Sergei Bunyachenko. Formed at Marwan-Kortensanjan, it fought briefly on the Oder front before switching sides and helping the Czechs liberate Prague. A 2nd Division, the 2nd Infantry, was incomplete when it left Lagerheuberg but was put into action under the command of General Mikhail Mendrov. This division was joined in large numbers by Eastern workers, which caused it to nearly double in size as it headed on its march south. A 3rd, the 3rd Infantry, only began formation. Several other Russian units, such as the Russian Corps, XVTHSS Cossack Cavalry Corps of General Helmut von Panwitz, the Cossack Camp of Ataman Dolmanov, and other primarily white Migra copyright formations had agreed to become a part of Vlasov's army. However, their membership remained de jure as the turn of events did not permit Vlasov to use these men in any operation. A small group of ROA volunteers fought against the Red Army on February 9, 1945. Their fighting vigor gained them the praise of Heinrich Himmler. The only active combat the Russian Liberation Army undertook against the Red Army was by the Oder on April 11, 1945, done largely at the insistence of Himmler as a test of the army's reliability. After 3 days, the outnumbered 1st Division had to retreat. On January 28, 1945, it was officially declared that the Russian divisions no longer formed part of the German army, but would directly be under the command of KONR. Vlasov then ordered the 1st Division to march south to concentrate all Russian anti-communist forces loyal to him. As the army, he reasoned, they could all surrender to the Allies on favorable terms. Vlasov sent several secret delegations to begin negotiating a surrender to the Allies, hoping they would sympathize with the goals of ROA and potentially use it in an inevitable future war with the USSR. Fight against the Germans and capture by the Soviets. During the march south, the 1st Division of the ROA came to the help of the Czech insurgents to support the Prague uprising, which started on May 5, 1945, against the German occupation. Vlasov was initially reluctant, but ultimately did not resist General Bunyachenko's decision to fight against the Germans. The 1st Division engaged in battle with Waffen-SS units that had been sent to level the city. The ROA units armed with heavy weaponry fended off the relentless SS assault, and together with the Czech insurgents succeeded in preserving most of Prague from destruction. Due to the predominance of communists in the new Czech Rada, the 1st Division had to leave the city the very next day and tried to surrender to U.S. Third Army of General Patton. The Allies, however, had little interest in aiding or sheltering the ROA, fearing such aid would severely harm relations with the USSR. Soon after the failed attempt to surrender to the Americans, Vlasov and many of his men were caught by the Soviets. Some soldiers were initially taken into Allied custody, then forcefully extradited to the Soviets by the Allies. However, some Allied officers who were sympathetic to the ROA soldiers permitted them to escape in small groups into the American-controlled zones. The Soviet government labeled all ROA soldiers as traitors. The ROA soldiers who were repatriated were tried and sentenced to detention in prison camps. Vlasov and several other leaders of the ROA were tried and hanged in Moscow on August 1, 1946. Order of battle: the composition of the versus KONR was as follows: Air elements, I Ostfliegerstaffel 2. Star paragraph Rukompstaffel KONR Air Force, 2 former Soviet Air Force ace pilots, Semyon Trofimovich Bychkov and Branislav Romanovich Antilevsky, defected and became part of the ROA Air Forces. The Air Force was later disbanded in the July of 1944. The Air Force was commanded by Major General Viktor Moltsov. See also, Ukrainian Liberation Army, Ukrainian National Army, Ostligenon, Russian Liberation Movement, Kaminsky Brigade, Lokot Republic, Operation Keel Hall, Russian Corps, Russian All-National Popular State Movement, Collaboration during World War II, Russian Monument, Victims of Yalta, a 1977 book by Nikolai Tolstoy detailing the forced repatriation of Soviet people after WWII, repatriation of Cossacks after World War II, Wehrmacht foreign volunteers and conscripts. References. Sources: The Gulag Archipelago, 1918-1956 by Alexandrai Solzhenitsyn, Army of the Damned, on 20th Century, CBS Documentary Series, December 1962. External links, articles: It's Too Early to Forgive Vlasov, The St. Petersburg Times, November 6, 2001, Other, Russian Liberation Army information page by veteran Alexander Dubov, Russian volunteers in the German Wehrmacht in World War II by Lieutenant General Ladislaw Anders and Antonio Munoz, Russian Liberation Army, rare footage.